I like this late LA2A best of all the LA2A emulations. I probably like it more even than real LA2As. I love playing with on my effects ends with like little alter boy and doing, pitch shift and distortion before the reverb, make a second voice channel and EQ it and, compress it more aggressively and bring it under as a parallel. But I won't send it to the mix, but I'll use that to send to my reverbs. And that way my reverbs come from a more aggressive or more controlled kind of sound. Well, I spend, the last hour of my mix is typically just automating the vocal. I'll go literally breath by breath and choose the right volume for it. I think the most important tool for adding depth is
Today, it's all about plugins, but not just from a technical standpoint. We're focusing on how they can take your mixes to the next level emotionally, helping you connect with your audience in a deeper level. We'll explore key mixing techniques on the plugins that have made a real difference in the productions of today's guest. Joining us is Alex Venguer, a multi-Grammy-winning engineer who has worked with some of the biggest names in music, including Sting, Lady Gaga, Dua Lipa, and Aretha Franklin. Hey Alex, how's it going? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me again. Happy to be here.
So, what are the plugins that have made a huge difference in your mixes? But more than just a list, I'm really interested to know why you chose those specific plugins. What do you gain emotionally and sonically from them?
I think that more than saying that there's a plugin that, shift, that because it's that plugin, it suddenly started happening that became a specific plugin that I needed. I think there were a couple plugins that got me into thinking of mixing in the box in a different way. And those plugins have changed over the time, but the concept of how I started getting into that kind of remained the same. And really, I think that the plugin that I would say did that for me was Slate Digital's VCC, their console collection. It was the first time that I thought of, putting console emulation on every channel on the session and having a emulation of a stereo bus in your master, and to kind of treat your mix as if you were on a board in that sense. And I still use VCC, although not all the time. I've shifted to, depending on the project, using different ones. And while I don't necessarily mix in a channel strip mode, I never think of like, I'm going to set up my channel strip with always SSL or always Neve or something like that. I kind of choose a general color for my console sound. And I think that was something that came from getting into Slate's VCC. So I would say that was the one plugin that really made that happen for me and started to make me think about, okay, how can I color my session from the beginning? And I think it's that, that's what gets you the emotion. You're choosing a color for whatever reason, be it the punchiness of, and kind of like roundness of an API style console, or, a more like really big bottoms SSLJ 9000 if you're doing like big pop or hip hop, going for a more, the warm classic Neve for, a jazz record. Or lately I've been getting into a lot of the ones that do tube emulations. And, for certain things that just really colors things in a very beautiful way. Another very specific example might be like the ones that do the Trident. It's all like these colors and palettes that just give you a starting point where your whole mix is going to kind of shift towards this kind of punchiness or roundness, warmth versus presence, et cetera, that, we all know from the different consoles.
Sure.
So that would be the one plugin that, exactly the one. And like I said, it's not the one that I use all the time anymore, even though I still use it. But it's the one that got me thinking like that. And, shifted my attention towards that. Other than that, I would say it's mostly finding a couple generally analog modeling EQs, not necessarily a 1073 or an API or something, but I like thinking about using plugin EQs that give you a couple different frequencies and boost and a cut, basically. I don't tend to fall for using something like, FabFilter's Q3 or the Yosis version or Infinity EQ, or even something like GML all the time, because I want to just be able to just kind of choose between a couple selected frequencies and just boost or gain as I need. And so the CSEQ by Slate is the other one that really got me into that mode of thinking. I find that EQ, again, it's not what I use all the time, but for a long time it was my main EQ. I still use it a lot, still think it's great. and it's really got me into thinking in that way of EQ. So like I recently got the console one by Softube, and I did a couple mixes where I set up the API. They have what they call the API original and extended. And with the original, you have the fixed frequencies, and with the extended, you actually can go in between. And I realized that I don't like having the option of like, have to select between 1 and 1.5K. I just kind of want to do the big dip. So those are the two big like mentality things that certain plugins got me into. Because before being in the box, when I was mixing on consoles, it was mostly mixing on SSLs, and it's a fully parametric, fully sweepable frequency band. And so I was used to that. But for some reason, it didn't feel natural to me in one of those plugins where you have, the spectrum analyzer. I don't like seeing, for starters. I hate seeing spectrum analyzers. Even if I'm going by my ears, it just weirds me out sometimes just seeing it. So I would say that those are the two big plugins that really shifted the way of thinking into how I mix in the box.
Mm-hmm. So now that you have the Control One, do you ever mix with your eyes closed?
I do, but not with the console one. The console one, which I use more for EQing, that kind of stuff, because I don't have the fader pack. I just have the one for the
No, but
controlling
that's
the
what
plugins.
I meant. I'm sorry, that's what I meant for EQ. For me, like faders are easier. I don't know why, but EQing with my eyes closed, it's way better.
I don't, and it's really funny because one of the things I have not loved about having the console one is that I look at the display more. I feel like just because it's there, even though you can see in my setup, my Raven is directly behind me. Oh, sorry, you can't really see it.
There you go.
And then there's a second monitor to the side, and that's where I have my console one display on. And even when I'm trying to not look at it, just the fact that it's there, I just keep looking at it. I just can't avoid it. And with the Raven, it's funny because with the Raven, you have the plugin directly in front of you, and you're obviously looking at it, and you're going like this. So I don't really do anything like EQing without my eyes. But in the Raven, I feel like I'm not looking at the numbers as much as I am on the console one, which is kind of not what it's supposed to be. But I think that's my own OCD. But when it comes to mixing, like, for example, when I go into volume automation using the Raven, I do very often, like on my vocal ride, like I'll close my eyes and do it with that. But for EQing that kind of stuff, I don't think I ever do it with my eyes closed.
So you're automating the vocals with the Raven?
Yeah, basically all my volume automation is with the Raven.
Because I never could do that. I don't know. It was hard for me.
It's hard to get used to it. And I do admit there are some days where I wish, there's certain moves where I'm like, oh, I wish I had one fader right now because this is like really jumpy today. I've noticed that if I'm haven't slept or if I'm tense or if I had too much coffee or till coffee, my touch is not, but I think that's, just me being very tense. I've broken a couple of buttons on consoles from hitting them too hard. People are always joking at how, like when I hit enter on the keyboard. And so I think I put too much pressure in. And when I've had too much coffee or too little, like that becomes a little hard tactilely. I just upgraded to the new Raven there, and overall I'm loving it. Again, there are some moments where I'm like, oh, I wish I had a real fader here, but there are also moments where I've been mixing projects where I'm using, a Navid controller or something like that because I'm at a studio that has that, and I'm like, oh, I wish I had my Raven for these kind of moves. So it goes a little bit both ways. It's what I've always said about the Raven, and I think it holds true, is that the technology still has a little further to go because obviously, technology just keeps getting. It's not that it has to go further; you just know it will because that's what technology does, right?
Sure.
And the other thing is that it's one, not for everybody, and two, it takes a while to get used to it, in my opinion, and to find your workflow. Even though it's very obvious, it took me a long time to find my workflow with it and what it made sense for me to do with my hands and what I still revert to using, with my mouse and keyboard. But overall, I love it, and I do find that doing automation is fun. You be able to set up your VCAs and literally grab a couple of them and do it like you were doing it on a console. You get used to it.
Cool. So going back to plugins, what does your mix bus chain typically look like?
Typically, it's Usually it has like some sort of harmonic color box. It tends to be the Plugin Alliance black box.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the first one over the second one better.
Mm.
Not because it sounds better. I've never compared them sonically. I just don't want that many options. The second one has,
Mm.
one too many options for me to think of. I like the simplicity of the basic one. I love that you just, that's one of the few things that I have a preset, where I start, and then once I kind of have my mix, maybe I'll go and push something here, or, like a little less or more of something. But that's usually my first thing. Then after that, I tend to have a compressor. And most of the time, it's either the Shadow Hills Class A, or if not, the Magic Dead Stereo. Those are the
Mm-hmm.
two ones that I usually default to. There's a couple projects where I really like one called El Cardinal by Acoustic Audio.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds beautiful, but it's, as with everything acoustic audio, if you're doing high sampling rate and, you have a huge session, it's just going to kill too much of your computer.
Mm.
So I choose it very sparingly. It's like just some projects where I know it's never going to get big and my computer is going to be able to handle having it on the stereo bus. So it's not that often that I use it, but I like it a lot. I've done a couple projects when I'll do like a 33609, or, try something different, like the UAD Capital one. But typically it's either the Shadow Hills or the Magic Dead Stereo one. Those are the
Mm-hmm.
two usual compressors that I have. And then from there, I have an EQ. The one I use the most often is the Chandler EQ, the curve bender. But every now and then for some projects, I switch it out for the NIF Soma. And after that, I usually put what would be like the stereo bus, master section emulation, be it one of those like VCCs, or, one of the Lindell 80 or 50 or 69 series. And lastly, I think pretty much every mix I've done over the last, at least 10, 15 years, I guess, has a Slate VTM, which I
Mm-hmm.
do like quite a bit.
Nice.
And then that's what I start with. Most of the time it stays as that. I'll start my mix with that on, the threshold off. I have a preset on my EQ, and basically I have everything with a preset, but the threshold is completely off and the EQ is very minimal. And then once I'm kind of, almost done with the mix, where I'm really, got my main levels and done some automation and everything, I'll go into the EQ and maybe touch up something else, start playing with the threshold. And at some point where I'm getting towards the end of the mix, I'll be like, oh, you know what? It feels like I need a little more of this or a little more of that or less of this or that. I'll go and switch something in terms of the settings, or sometimes I'll add like a final, like there's times where I'm loving the mix, but I'm like, you know what, there's just this one frequency that just keeps pushing up. I'll add a Waze EQ and, use dynamic mode on it. Or if it's a
Mm-hmm.
little harsh, maybe I'll throw, the Waze DS, or give it, I love the Overstayer plugin. So sometimes I'll, if it's something really punchy, I'll like maybe throw that in at like 5-10%. Sometimes I'll add a little something at the end, but it's usually not. It's usually that list of plugins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I need to try that overstayer. Yeah, for sure.
It's really great.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the things that I love about the console one is now I have it as a default of one of my sections. Since like, any track that I want to throw it on, it's like, it's already there and just like go fast.
Oh, cool. Do you use something to enhance the stereo with?
No, not really. Every now and then, and I don't think I've done it in the last couple of years, but on certain very pop mixes, sometimes I'll throw like, the isotope widener where you can like set the high frequencies
Mm-hmm.
to like open up a little more in the chorus or something like that. I've done that here and there, but rarely. What I do use sometimes, and it's not in my default, but I will do sometimes, is a bunch of the Plugin Alliance plugins have the mono low end knob.
Oh, yeah.
Basically,
Mm-hmm.
you select that frequency and everything below that becomes mono. And so in certain mixes, I do, like 40 or 50 and everything below that on mono with one of those plugins. But it's not my default, only if I need it.
Mm-hmm. And do you automate
But
something
no,
in your mix bus now?
not typically. I've done it. And if I
Mm-hmm.
find a situation where it makes sense to do so, for example, the widener, but generally I don't. One thing that I do find myself doing a lot when it comes to classical records is I'll get a mix, and then at the very end, once I'm pretty happy with the mix, sometimes I'll try throwing the fat filter reverb on it.
Oh.
at like 5-6%. I have a couple of settings that I like on it that really do that well. Just gel the whole mix. And sometimes I'll do something like, automating the wet dry in that plugin.
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, I'm careful of when I choose to do it, because if you do it and then they ask you to do an Atmos upmix of the song, then that becomes a pain. So
Mm-hmm.
I try to check or find a way to do it where like it's not going to be a pain in the future. So I've tried to stay away from doing too much master boss automation to keep my options open towards the possibility of any Atmos mixes.
Mm-hmm.
And
And what?
actually, one big thing that's changed because of that is that in the past I've always just used the internal sidechain to use to control the threshold of my. I'm blanking out. Sorry. I should use just set up the compressor to respond to its internal.
Uh-huh.
Why am I blanking out on the word? Anyways, usually used to work with it like that. And over the last couple of months, I've switched to where even when I'm doing a stereo mix, I have all my channels send a mono, but through a mono bus following my mix. And that is what I use as my sidechain. That way, if I have to go to an Atmos up mix, I can throw the same compressor across my different buses and object masters, and the threshold will be hit by the same signal. And so it responds the same way, as opposed to being internal.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that's changed recently because of that.
And do you ride the volume on the mix bus or
No,
no?
I mean, I've done it here and there, like on pop songs where like you want, the chorus to hit 0.5 dB up, or
Mm-hmm.
I've done it here and there, but usually I take care of all the automation within the tracks.
Oh, cool.
I usually do it in the actual tracks, and then that way I don't have to do it in the master.
Mm-hmm.
But I've done it, just not often.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So let's talk about the your vocal chain. What
Mm-hmm.
what do you use for vocals?
It really is varied, because it really, it kind of strikes me at the moment of as I'm like, okay, here's a vocal, bring the fader up, and okay, what am I going to do to this vocal? And there's a couple of plugins that I'll, similar to my master bus, there's a couple that I love for vocals, and but I can't say that there's like one thing. But for example, for compressor, I tend to use either the Magic Deadeye I like a lot. I just got the new UTA on Fairchild, which is
Mm-hmm.
proving very good on vocals. Um, for anything that's, kind of like on the jazzy or Broadway side, I love the Acoustic Audio Amber, which emulates the Avalon optical compressor. I usually use at least two compressors in the vocal, and it'll be a combination of something, again, like some sort of Varimu, like the 670 or the Capital or Magic Deadeye. And then maybe I'll throw one of the Tube Tech ones or a distressor, if I want it to be more aggressive. I don't default to, like always using something like an LA2A or 1176, but I do find that there's times where I feel that it's right for it. So it really does depend on the voice in terms of what I want to get out of it, and why
Mm-hmm.
I'm compressing.
I'm sorry. Those
Which was,
compressors
yeah.
are in series, right?
Yes, exactly. In series, not parallel.
Uh-huh.
And usually, there's times where I do one, then the other, and then I'll EQ. There's times where I'll do one, then EQ, then do the other one. It really is kind of like, like pulling to your head and be like, okay, what do I want to use here? Like, what makes sense now?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also has to be like where my ears are that day and what my vibe is feeling in regards to the song. And like the other thing is if I got a new plugin, maybe I'll just default to using that one because I want to, I'm excited for the new plugin. So there's, like I said, there's a couple that I venture for usually. Other ones that I like this late LA2A best of all the LA2A emulations. I probably like it more even than real LA2As.
Mm-hmm.
What else do I use a lot on vocals? I think a lot of the time, like if I'm really happy with the vocal sound and just feel like it needs a little extra compression, I'll go back to our comp. It's just such a nice invisible compressor that just like smooths a little bit more. So that's one that I use still quite a bit. But it's never the one that I kind of go from the start. It's always kind of once I have my vocal sound, I'll be like, oh, it needs a little more compression. Let's add this. If I want something super transparent, I'll go with one of the Waze ones. those are kind of like, a good example of like the ones that I use the most. El Rey, actually, that's another one that I use a lot. The acoustic audio El Rey. I really love it on vocals. And then, for EQ, the CSEQ by Slate is, the EQ that I've used the most over the last couple of years. But I love love Pultex on vocals as well. And I'll use the Neve Soma quite a bit if I want to soften something. I think those are, kind of like the basic EQs that I use. Very often I'll choose a tape emulation for each channel, depending on the project. I might, use VTM, or I might use the soft tube one. I very rarely use the UAD once I find that they might distort a little faster than I want them to.
Mm-hmm.
But the soft tube I use quite a bit, and the VTM I use a lot. And then for de-essing, I always use the EOSys de-esser. That's usually what I like.
Mm-hmm.
Every now and then I'll have to throw one or two de-essers if it's a very, aggressive vocal, and I like the Waves one as well quite a bit. So that's, that's a general.
Mm-hmm. But if you use the tape emulation plugin, do you start with that or?
Yes, I do actually. That's one of the few things, and I don't really have a template. I kind of build every mix each time.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I do have is like I'll start with the channel strip, not channel strip, but rather like the console color that I want at the top of the channel. And then I used to do it that I would put VTM or the soft tube one at the end, and kind of just mix, EQ into it and compress into it. But now that I'm using console one quite a bit because it puts it at the beginning of the chain and you can change that, it's kind of shifted that. Not such a big deal. It's not like I'm using it so aggressively that it matters.
Mm-hmm.
But it's usually there from the beginning, yes. I usually do have the tape from the beginning.
Okay. Yeah. So, and do you usually use a parallel compression?
On vocal, no, not really. Not unless there's something specific that I'm trying to achieve. I don't default to it. I will sometimes use it in the way that, like, if I'm using a compressor, I'm liking what it's doing, and I like the color, but it's a little too much. Maybe I'll use, parallel it with a wet knob. But very rarely do I have a second channel to add more compression underneath it, just because all the plugins have it. However, I do use it sometimes where, like, I'll do something like in the chorus to have a little extra impact. I might make a second voice channel and EQ it and, compress it more aggressively and bring it under as a parallel. But it's only like for specific situations where it calls for it. It's definitely not something I default to. Or I'll do that and I'll use it I won't send it to the mix, but I'll use that to send to my reverbs. And that way my reverbs come from a more aggressive or more controlled kind of sound.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So, and if you want to add some air to the vocals, you just grab the slate EQ, or maybe you would use something else?
Usually, if I'm feeling that it's a little dark and I just want a little extra bit, I usually throw it on my de-esser, because that's one of the nice things about the EOSys de-esser. It has that air band to it that only affects the non-sibilant frequency, signal. So that's something that, like, if I'm kind of feeling happy, I'm like, oh, I wish it had a little more air. That's usually what I do. But it's not that often. Usually once I kind of get my sound, I tend to stick with it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what about effects? What effects do you like on vocals?
That I use a lot, mostly I use on vocals whatever I'm using for the whole band. And the way I think of, mixing is I'll start finding my space as the first thing I do on the mix. Kind of once I listen to the song and see what the vibe is, I'll choose what kind of space I want for the whole song, for the whole mix. And so I'll bring my vocal up without an EQ or compression or anything, and just start playing, trying to find what reverbs and what effects work on the vocal. And then once I have that, I'll bring the vocal down, start working on the music, and then eventually bring the vocal back up. But that way, by the time I'm done, like, all my effects are kind of created. And so I'm always working in the space that I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
And so very typically I'll have a room reverb, then what I call my dark plate, which originally used to be, for a long, long time, it was the Lexicon PCM plate. It's a patch that I made that I really liked. And unfortunately, ever since I switched to a newer computer a couple of months ago, that plugin doesn't work anymore because it never got ported. So I've been trying to replace it. I sort of found a setting on Valhalla plate that doesn't quite sound the same, but it's sort of doing the same thing. And so that's, it's kind of like a 1.4 to 1.6 millisecond long reverb, a little on the dark side. And then from there on, it really changes mixes to mix. If I'm doing a folk record, I might just find a very short chamber that just gives it a little air and space. If I'm doing a jazz record, I want something like a bigger chamber or a plate. If I'm doing, indie pop thing, maybe I want a spring. So really at that point, there really is no default, but I usually do wind up having, very often a plate, a chamber, sometimes like a synthetic. Like I love plugins like the CLA, plugin that does all the reverbs, because it has great presets that you just like pull up and then play with them. It's sort of like using an H3000, then that you're not going to go and build the patch, but you kind of go through the programs, find one you like, and then adjust it. So you can find some great stuff there. I love playing with on my effects ends with like Little Alter Boy and doing pitch shift and distortion on the before the reverb or something like that. Some of the reverbs I default to a lot are Magic Deadeye Chamber, the Capital Chamber, and this is for voice specifically. The Slate Plate, what's it called? I forget what their plate is called, or the Echo Boy, Sound Toys plate. Those are the ones that I tend to go for. Every now and then I'll find that like, if I'm doing something very pop, the soft tube chamber is really nice. It's got a little more control. You can really tailor it. And if I'm doing something where I want a little less control and a little more vintage sound, I'll use like the Abbey Road plate, for example. I do use Valhalla quite a bit, and lately I discovered that just came out with it, the Relab Rev 6000, which is like their emulation of the TC6000, and that has one of my favorite like hall sounds for vocal. One other one that I've been using a lot over the last couple of years, which I completely stole from Emmett Shiner, is one of the patches from the 480, which is a small church for vocals. It's a beautiful patch. And then I usually do have a stereo delay that's, typically synced to the time, either eighth or quarter, depending on the kind of song and the tempo. And you don't necessarily hear it much as an echo, but I typically don't use pre-delay. Actually, not typically. I very rarely use pre-delays on my reverbs. And so I use those delays to kind of create that imaging of a pre-delay. If the song calls for it, I'll use a doubler, or slap delay. I love the J37 by Waves for slap. I think it sounds really, really cool. Or the Kramer one also. And very often I have either a Dimension D kind of plugin, like the Microshift by Sound Toys, or the UAD DMX, which does the pitch shifting and delay as well, kind of as a thickener. And then from there on, it really is about, what each song is called. Like those are the kind of things that I default to. But, then from there, like it might be something more specific.
So talking about tuning vocals, what's your top plugin for tuning vocals? Could you walk us through your process and, I don't know, any tips for making it sound natural?
Yeah, I'm a Melodyne person for sure. Haven't used Autotune in forever. I do have this late one because I beta test for them and I think it works great, but I don't typically do the automatic thing. So for me, Melodyne is what makes the most sense. I still don't love using it on ARA mode. I still like the plugin better. I find it's a little more organized in terms of how I can save my sessions and go back to them, because I'll do a lot of projects where we'll do a comp, I'll tune it, then the singer will listen like, now I want to re-sing this or re-comp this, and then you have to go back and retune. And I never want to tune on top of something I already tuned. So I have a very specific way of organizing playlists and plugins for the Melodyne. And I find that with the ARA version, even though I found a way, it's a little more cumbersome. So I like to use a plugin. Never an automatic, always do it graphic and just, go part by part. And I think the trick to making it seem natural is to make sure that the voice always, curves in and out of the notes. If you kind of just start squaring stuff up, it sounds completely fake. And if you're going for that, then that's obviously the case. But, if what you're doing is trying to tune and keep it natural, I think it's all about cutting shorter sections and making sure that as you move the notes, you're kind of keeping some sort of a curve going, because if you just like jump to the note, then that's where it feels weird. I don't. I'm lucky in that most of the singers that I work with are generally pretty close.
Uh,
So I'm not shifting a note by huge amounts for the most part. So it makes it easier, obviously. But I also don't use automatic. What do you call it when you double click and then it taps it to the
mhm.
to the grid? I actually do it by ear. I'll kind of just move it and see where it feels right, and I'll go back and like, oh, it's a little sharp still, and I'll flat and move it again. And I do cut quite a bit. So for me, the trick is lots of cuts, and then like really tailoring your curve, and then finding where the part of the note that really wants to sit in the real center is. Because no singer just hits the center and just stays there. There's this. So making sure you keep vibrato, making sure you find where your center is going to really hit as the most important part, so that it's not just, don't think of the note has to be here. It's like, sure, the note starts here, starts coming up, and then when it gets at this point, that's where it really is perfectly in tune, and then it starts going away.
Perfect.
So that's kind of how I think of tuning.
Hmm. Yeah. So, how do you make sure a listener feels emotionally connected to a mix? Which elements are most important to you in achieving this?
I think it's some combination of three things, maybe. I mean, I'm making this up as I'm saying it, so it might not be three, but I think the space of the mix
Uh huh.
is very important, because it basically puts you in where you're listening. And one of the things that I've discovered over the last couple of months, now that I've kind of gotten into mixing a couple of the Atmos things, is the Apple AirPods have such nice noise cancellation that I'm really enjoying listening to music in them, because you suddenly, the noise cancellation makes you disappear from the room you're in and just be in the room that the music's in. And so that's probably number one for me, is making sure that the space of the music is right. If you're listening to a jazz record that wants to feel like it's in a club, you need to find the space that's the club. If it's a very intimate thing, or you want to feel the space of a smaller room, and if you're listening to a big orchestra that has to feel huge, you want to feel the huge space. So getting the listener in the right space is number one for me in that sense, I think, and that comes from effects mostly. Then after that, I would say, and this is funny because I'm going to put this part first, even though I've always been somebody who goes for melody. Like the thing that gets me the most about music is melody. However, I'm going to say that for the music, I mean, for the mix, getting the groove to sit right is huge. I mean, so much of popular music, especially, is all about, dancing and the club and feeling the groove when you're, out, or like you're playing it loud, that kind of thing. So I think if you're not feeling the groove right, then you're not going to connect emotionally to it. Obviously, this doesn't apply to certain music that's not groove based, but I think it's even true in like a lot of the classical stuff I do, like string quartet stuff. Like if the pace of the groove isn't right, and you haven't given a mix definition and heft that lends to that groove,
Mm-hmm.
the emotion is not going to be there. So I think the rhythmic element of the mix has to sit right, so that people can really feel that in their bodies. And then, even though it's probably the most important, I'm going to put it last, is making sure that if it's a sung vocal, obviously the lyric has to be there. The lyric's important. You have to be able to understand it. You have to feel the singer. Or if it's melodic, with an nail instrument doing a melody, the focus of the song is the melody, or
Mm-hmm.
whoever is supposed to be the focus. Um, so I put it in that order, even though at the end of the day, the three of them are as important. Probably number one would be the melody, is, the most important thing. But that's kind of how I think of it. You have to have the right space, feel the groove and the rhythm of the music, and then have the focus be forefront, so that the people really, get the melody, get the lyrics, get the emotional impact of, the most direct part of the music, which is that.
Mm-hmm. And
Actually, let me rephrase that. The most direct would
okay.
be the rhythmic.
Uh-huh.
The most impactful might be the more obvious and obviously impactful is the melody.
Perfect. And what role does automation play in all of this? I mean, to
Oh,
enhance the storytelling aspect of the song.
so much. I mean, because for starters, without automation on a vocal, unless you're doing, a punk record where it's all sung and, like everything's kind of just sitting there, or like, something like that, you really need to write vocal by vocal. I spend, the last hour of my mix is typically just automating the vocal. I'll go literally breath by breath and choose the right volume for it. That's one of the things that I actually do with the mouse as opposed to the Raven. I
Oh,
just go through. Once I finish doing my automation and I'm happy with it, I'll go back and then switch to trim mode and just trim down the breaths one by one to where I like them. At the end of every word, if there's an S or a consonant, making sure it's loud enough that you hear it, but not loud enough that it sounds like you brought it up. Same with the breath. You want to bring it down, but you don't want to disappear it.
mm-hmm.
So those little things, like where the breath sits relative to the voice, creates the emotion of the singer a lot. Because when the microphone is here, the breaths are obviously exaggerated. So getting that right really affects the emotion of the singer, I think. So that's number one, just getting the vocal in the right place, making sure that you can understand all the lyrics by doing word by word. And that what I'll do is, like I said, I'll do a couple writes on the Raven, and then I'll go into trim mode and do a couple more writes with it on trim mode. And then once I'm very happy with it, I'll go back and I'll make my vocal track big. And this is even before doing the breaths. I'll listen through and be like, oh, the beginning of this word could come up a little bit more or a little bit less, and I'll paint that in with automation with my mouse. Just like kind of pushing what I already did, or maybe as I wrote, I was like, oh, you know what, I actually overdid this. Let me trim it down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So my first pass or two or three might be are all like by feel and touching the Raven, or if I'm any controller or a console. And then after that, I do a pass where I'm actually like just very analytically looking at it, and be like, okay, yeah, this word is slightly too punchy at the beginning. Let me soften that. So that's one of the elements where I think automation really plays a big role, is just getting the melody or the voice at the right place. Second would be, just making sure that the song moves as it has to. Again, going back to, being able to work with amazing musicians, is that most of the time, the people I work with are creating those dynamic changes
Mm-hmm.
within their playing. So as long as I don't crush it with compression, I don't have to push it. But even then, like there'll be things like the project that I just finished mixing earlier today, it's a string quartet and they like a lot of presence in their sound. So the mix has about pretty even close miking versus room miking at the end of the day. And it's a very long, like 18-minute piece. And the very end becomes very airy and just like suddenly starts, it goes to like almost no sound at the very end. So what I did is, for the last minute, I just have a very slow fade across about a minute and a half, where the closed mics just by the end of the piece are completely out. And you'd never really hear, like if if I play to you, I'd be like, oh wait, what happened? Like the closed mics are out. But what that does is suddenly the impact of the mix went from like everything being here to, as they get airier, suddenly they kind of do this. And so that's something that you achieve only with automation, and it can't be done naturally by playing. And it's very subtle because, at the end of the day, there are quartet that wants to sound like they sound, but it just enhances the emotion and the feeling of where they're taking the music. Same with, you can do the same with like automating a volume difference in drums. Or one of the things that I miss a lot about mixing on an SSL, for example, is I used to be able to, loop the verse, get my drum sounds right, record the
Mm-hmm.
mix pass, and then switch to preview, go to the chorus, move my faders again to the what I thought was the better sound for the mix, and then just roll back, hit join,
Mm-hmm.
play, and then join at the right time, and your faders would just snap. The way to do that in Project is by just doing a duplicate set of tracks, or otherwise it's a pain in automation. But that's the kind of thing where automation really drives emotion and and the flow of a song. And I still have not found a way of doing it in the box that feels like it used to on a
Mm.
console. And that's even true even with like the Pro Tools controllers. I think that's even true with flying faders. That's something that only like SSL automation can do. And I miss that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, you start automating at the end of your mix, or when do you start
Yeah.
automating?
Yeah. Usually, I'll do some automation when it comes to some effects automation, or like if I want some EQ automation, or like different compression for the verse and the chorus, maybe I'll automate that. But really what I do is I work on getting a really good static mix where I know it's not going to be right through the whole song, obviously, but it gets me the right feel of the song. I know that my groove is right. I know the place, my effects are right. Everything's kind of sitting in the right place. And then from there, I'll go and automate. And I tend to automate. I used to automate where I would like turn the vocal off and do the mix and then bring the vocal in and then go back and adjust as needed. But these days I tend to just put my vocal in a certain spot, leave it there, work on the mix around it, and then automate the vocal over it. But again, this also changes depending on the style. Because if I'm doing a jazz trio with a singer, then I kind of leave the band where it is, automate the voice, and as I'm automating the voice, I might automate one of the instruments as if I feel that it needs it. So it does depend on the style of music and what you're going for. But typically, I don't turn on automation until I'm fairly happy with my, the overall sound of the mix.
Mm-hmm.
And I just know that the levels are gonna have to be adjusted in spots.
Nice. Let's talk about life in the studio for a moment. What has been the
Mm-hmm.
most challenging situation you've faced in the studio while working with a well-known artist?
That's. I think the most challenging thing is when they get in their heads, and you're trying to be optimistic, but you're also not trying to not make them feel like you're just leading them on.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very very thin line between pushing them and telling them they're doing good, especially when they're not particularly doing good that day for whatever reason, and just being like kind of a yes man. You really don't want to just be like, oh yeah, you're doing great when you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so musicians getting in their head, especially singers, I think that's the hardest thing. Either that or when you're dealing with somebody who's not that great and you just know that you're not going to get any better. Or even when somebody who is great, but for some reason that, they've done the vocal, this punch for, 30, 40 times and it's not getting any better and you just kind of know that it never will. And so dealing with that without taking them down, a rabbit hole of bad thinking and bad feelings, that's one of the hardest things. I can't think of a specific moment, really. I really can't, which is, count myself lucky for that.
Yeah, that's a good thing. I was thinking about
But,
that. Yeah.
those kind of moments are really hard, because you want them to be happy, you want them to succeed, you want them to get it right. And sometimes, it's just not the moment when it's going to happen. And it has nothing to do with being good or being bad, We've all heard countless stories of, so-and-so coming in and doing a couple takes and the producer being like, you know what, go home, we'll come back tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
The hard thing is that could be done in the past. Nowadays, even with people with budgets, it's hard to do that because, the money is not the same as it used to be 20 years ago or more.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to tell a singer, don't worry about it, go home, we'll come back in 3 days and do it again because, usually people saved for that one day of studio that they had. So it's tough in that sense. But yeah, I think that would be, those are the kind of the worst moments in the studio when you're in that position.
You worked with Sting multiple times. What is a typical session with him like?
Well, the funny thing is I've worked with him personally only a few times. I've done a lot of work on his stuff, but a lot of time most of the time it's been with the producer or mixing on my own or, tracking strings or this or that for him. But whenever I've worked with him, he really is all about the impact of the music. From what I got from him, he could not care any less about the gear or, how it's happening. He really is all about the emotional impact of the music. And, so as long as things are working and nothing sounds bad, he's just going to do his thing and let you do your thing, which I find is very true about a lot of great musicians, especially from that era. I find that because we have so much more accessibility to, cheaper microphones, interfaces, Pro Tools at home, most of singer-songwriters, artists, composers, et cetera, have access to these tools and know some of it at this point. So they get a little more involved. But when you're talking about, people like Sting, I always use Loudon Wainwright as an example. Like, he doesn't care what microphone is in front of him. He just wants to sing and get it on tape. So, that generation of musicians, I find are a little less concerned with that stuff. And just as long as it's sounding right, it's sounding right. They're doing their job, you're doing yours.
Do you remember the vocal chain you used on him?
I've used various. My favorite my favorite one wound up being the Slate VMS. For a long time, I used to use either my C12 or 251 through a 1073. And I think that sounds great on him. I did a couple sessions where I I came in because the engineer who was doing the record wasn't available, and they were already set up, and it was with a U47 going through a 1073 and an LA2A. I'm not a fan of a U47 on his voice. I think it gets too husky. Sting's voice has obviously changed. He's not 20 anymore, and
Hmm.
even though he sings beautifully, still it's a much huskier voice. And I think the 47 brings that like mid range out in a way that's not quite as flattering as other mics. That's why I like the 251 or the C12 because it really brings the top end out.
Mhm.
I've mixed a bunch of stuff that was recorded by other people for him where they're using a U47, and I always find that it's hard to mix a U47 with him. I'm personally not a fan of U47s as it is, except on a couple of specific voices, but it's not my go-to mic. And I did one project with him where a friend of mine had just bought this late VMS, and I was like, oh, let me try it. We were at Sear Sound here in New York, and I thought it'd be very fun to, put up our vintage 251, go through a vintage 1073, and put up this late mic and mic pre, and then, go home and compare them. And when I did, we did an edit of the song it was a song for another singer. They did a duet. Her name's Jo Laurie. A song called, I'll let you know, and you can put it in the comments or something
Sure.
because I'm forgetting. And basically we edited his voice. And what I did is every time there was an edit, this was when I was back home, I switched from the real 251 through the VMS,
Mm-hmm.
and you kind of just staggered, with every edit, and then consolidated it. So I couldn't actually see where the switches
Oh.
happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I could guess between, the 251 real and not. My impression is that this late one might be a little brighter and the S is kind of a little more sibilant in a bad way. But considering that's, $1,000 versus,
Yeah.
close to $35,000, it's really crazy how close it is. Like I would not be willing to bet that I
Uh,
can find where the changes are. But what was even more fun was that when I went to do the mix, I actually started trying different mics and mic pre's on his voice with the
mm.
VMS and wound up loving the C800 through the Telefunken pre
Oh.
emulations. And to me, that sounded much better than the 251 1073, real microphone and pre. And that's what's on the mix. It's, I didn't use the 251 in the end. I used the
Oh.
VMS through the C800. And then talking to a friend of mine who's an engineer in LA, and I was telling him this, he was like, "Oh, interesting," because I don't know if you know, but all those old records that we all have with Sting, that was a very common mic for him back in the day. And so I guess part of it is that emotionally,
Uh-huh.
hearing that on his voice just takes you to like, oh, that's what
Uh-huh.
I know of the Sting sound. So if I ever do a session with him at this point anymore, I'll probably do the VMS
Mm-hmm. Cool.
or a real C800.
Mm. And what about compression and effects on his vocal? Do you remember what did you use?
Uh,
Use?
I whenever I've recorded him, I've never compressed him.
Mm-hmm.
I very rarely compress vocals during tracking. I never want to, accidentally miss a take because I overcompressed or because it's saturated or whatever. So I rarely compress in vocal tracking. So with him, I don't think I've ever used a compressor in tracking except when it was already preset, being an LE2A. And when it comes to mix, I mean, I can't remember. I've used similar to what I said, all sorts of plugins that have changed through the years.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the one thing about me and plugins is I find them very fun. So my plugin chains keep changing a lot as new stuff comes out. Not even because I think they sound better or worse. It's just because it's fun to try new stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to mixing techniques, if a track feels flat or lifeless, what are your go-to techniques for adding energy?
At that point, probably compression. Obviously, again, dependent on the style. But I'd say a lot of intense parallel compression. And again, I don't usually necessarily do it by doing a second track and bring it under parallel, but using the mix knob on the plugins. And also something that I didn't used to do, but I've gotten into over the last couple of years, like maybe the last year and a half or two, is using more saturation plugins for that kind of thing. And so I think that just, color stuff in a way that at least it's sonically more exciting. And then it really comes down to, using automation and effects to really bring out the life in the song as much as you can. But, there is just so much you can do. If the song and the performance are not there, there's just so much you can do.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bottom
Yeah,
line.
sure.
At the end of the day, uh, we can only do as good a job as the musician's song and performance is.
Mm-hmm. Any techniques to create depth in your mixes?
Yeah, I think it's mostly the use of delays. I do a lot of things like, where I'll pan a guitar here and throw up, 32 or 40 millisecond delay out of phase over here on the other side, cross pan, just so that it doesn't feel like it's a monosource that's here. There's actually a little spread.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Stuff like, the Dimension D style plugin or the DMX gives you that depth. I find that a combination of more than one reverb, and I'll have up to, in a regular pop song, I'll have 6 or 7 reverbs going usually. I think that a combination of many reverbs helps create a space that's not as unique as saying like, oh, check it out, it's going through a plate, but gives you that combination of, depth that like only comes from a combining different spaces. I don't know if that makes sense. It's like, because it doesn't sound like just like a plate, the depth is a little different. There might be the smoothness of a chamber with the modulation of a spring, that comes with a spring reverb, that kind of thing. But I think the most important tool for adding depth is panning and delays. I have a couple delays set up left to right that ping pong from one side to the other and crossfeed. And if I have an instrument here, I'll send it to this side if I have it on this side, and that just like amplifies your width without it being problematic. If I'm in 5/1 or Atmos, like I'll do stuff like, instead of having them left to right, I'll do front to rear. That kind of, so, like that's the kind of thing, delays are the thing that give you the sensation of space. So that's what gives you depth, I think,
Right.
even more so than reverbs.
Mm-hmm.
But I use them always in conjunction with reverbs.
A lot of people talk about the sweet spot of the plugin. Is that something you were concerned with?
Yes, but I don't think of it as the sweet spot of the plugin. I think of it as like, I might just, is my channel coming in too hot or too quiet? My audio into the channel. Once I've kind of, found a good, initial starting point. And usually if I recorded something myself, I know that it's going to be where I like it. But, it's very often that you get tracks that are recorded way too hot. And so, first thing you do is just,
Clip
that's
gain,
one of the nice things of having something like, or I don't typically do clip gain, because then if somebody's like, hey, I want to send you a re-edit, or, like I decided to change this one thing and you forget how much you did, or you had consolidated, or you somehow forgot that you had done it. So I tend to like doing it in my first plugin, which tends to be, like, again, either the VCC or like the channel strip, Neve or whatever channel I'm using. I use the input on that and just bring it down or up as needed. So I don't get too concerned with like finding the sweet spot. I just want to make sure that it's not hitting it too hard or too soft. It's just in a good, healthy place. I do find that a lot of plugins, and this is true about analog gear, are like, they kind of sound good in certain, like, Pultex. 9 out of 10 times that you use it, you end up, 60 for the low end and kind of doing like this, and then 10 or 12K fully broad, and up to like 1 or 2. That's a very typical setting that I wind up defaulting with real Pultex. And the same thing happens with plugins. 1176s. If your gain staging is right, 9 out of 10 times you're going to wind up with your input and output kind of like, at this point, then with the attacks, backwards. And so, they do have, all these boxes tend to have a place where they sit the best. And I don't think it's specific about plugins. I think it's, just gear is where it sounds right. But I don't think that I specifically think of it as the sweet spot. It's just that I kind of move it. And like I said,
yeah.
If you look at it by percentage, most of the times it winds up sitting kind of in that area. Yeah.
Is there a specific effect, compressor EQ, or any type of plugin that doesn't exist yet, but you wish someone would create?
No, I think, at this point, it's like everything's pretty amazing.
Everything's done.
I don't know that everything's done. I just don't have the creativity to think of, what else are we missing? But I find it's a really exciting time, because you have things like, I would have never thought that something like, I forget what the name of it is, but that plugin by Eventide, that's an EQ, split EQ.
Yeah.
Where you can EQ the transient differently than the body. I would have never thought that that's something that I would want. And I don't use it a lot, but when I use it, it's like, I'm like so happy that it exists and I have it. I find Soothe can be overdone, but I find it very useful also. There might be one too many of those kind of plugins at that point, but they're great, and it's just, at the end of the day, you still have to use your ears, no matter, no matter how automatic it is.
It's just another
Like
tool.
I'll put up Sooth.
Hmm.
Exactly. I'll put up Sooth and I rarely play with it. Like I'll put it on and just set how much mix versus what I want. And that just comes down to how much it's affecting the signal at the end of the day.
Hmm.
If there's something specific, I might move the frequency to like a one that's jumping out, but most of the time it's just like the default setting and I'll just use my mix knob on it. So again, at the tool's there and you just have to use your ears to make sure you don't overdo it because things start sounding weird if you overdo it. So, I don't think it's taking over our jobs or anything like that. I think at this point, that kind of AI is very helpful, especially for people who don't necessarily want to be mixers. They just want to be able to put, their music out and that's their, you know, they don't have the ability of paying an extra mixer and they just want to put stuff out or they're doing it for fun. I think it's great that people have access to those things. So I find it's a really, really fun time for audio. There's just like so
Hmm.
many
Yeah.
plugins. I mean, if anything, I wish they stopped making them because I
Yeah.
just keep buying them every day.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Kind of broke right now, so.
Exactly, right? It's like so many plugins. It's like, and also the thing is like, for example, Safari Pedals just put out their Hawk face. And because I already paid for their subscription, not subscription, but their, the package and it's like $15 for it. I was like, oh, yes, of course I'm going to
Yeah.
get it. Do I
Hmm.
need another face in my life? No, but you never know when you will use it. And that's the thing, I'm doing the kind of projects where I'm doing a mix with an artist, and like there's a specific problem, and every now and then a plugin comes out that I don't use very often, but I'm like, okay, this just saved me today,
Yeah.
and then it was worth buying because that's my job, and that's
Uh-huh.
I'm a problem solver for the musician and the artist.
Have you tried the George Massenburg compressor? I can't remember the name, DW3 or something
No,
like that.
I actually just saw your Frank Petty interview yesterday, and I work with Frank quite a bit, and he talked about it.
Uh-huh.
I believe that it must be amazing. I find them so confusing.
That's what
I
I,
have
yeah.
the Yeah, I have the AMIC one, which does kind of similar. It's based on their analog GML compressor,
Uh-huh.
and I'll kind of just move the knobs until I get it to sound right, or until I get bored and frustrated by not getting it to sound right, and then I'll take it off and use something else.
Yeah.
But when I get it to sound right, it's like nothing
Amazing.
else does what it does.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But I'm too lazy to read up on it, and I have no clue how it works.
I'm just watching his videos. I'm trying to learn that, but I'm not even close. So
that's a no, that's a whole other level of
uh-huh.
of brilliance
Yeah.
that
Uh-huh.
yeah.
For sure.
So I know, and the one that Frank spoke about, I forget what at the end, like you said, MDW or something like that. I've never used that one, but I've used the analog box. I used to mix a lot on the Sony Oxford console,
Hmm.
and that had the GML compressor and EQ on it. And again, same kind of thing. I would move the knobs until it either sounded right or it didn't, and I used something else.
Hmm.
I've always thought about that with his compression. It's very convoluted,
Uh-huh. For sure. Yeah.
but magical.
Hmm. Alex, thank you
Yeah.
so much once again for being here.
Of course, my pleasure. So much fun. Thanks for having me.